start by introducing ourselves, Waddy. Fill some space, if you like. Or sorry, Amy, or you could.
I could, absolutely. Well, for those who don't know who I am, Jill and Kobe, and I actually know Natalie Quinn from uni days, so it's so nice to see you on here, Nat. But Amy Watson, and I am based in the Mary Valley in Queensland. I'm on the steering committee for the Regen Farmers Mutual and was involved in the co-design process earlier in the year. I also work for the Food and Agribusiness Network in my region, and I'm a certified organic lime producer as well. So welcome to you all. And Jackie, maybe you'd like to introduce yourself, and then we'll move on to the boys as the others join.
Well, listening to your introduction, I feel like I'm your twin. So I also have a property in southeast Queensland, further south than Amy, in the Moreton Bay region, and I grow horticultural crops and make really fancy salad and do some grazing cattle and lease some country, more grazing. And I am the Moreton Bay coordinator for the Food and Agribusiness Network. And I was also on the ride through the co-design process and now on the steering committee for the Regen Farmers Mutual. Would you like me to introduce you, Andrew and Rohan, or would you like to do that yourselves?
Either way. Paul, how about, given I'm speaking, and I'll just get embarrassed if you introduce me, so I'll do it much briefer. So I've got a finance background, so I'm originally an investment banker, and I left that kind of industry back in 2007. I've been working in the community sector basically since then. So I met Wardy about 5 years ago. We started a incubator for co-ops. So we have a joint love of co-ops and mutuals, and I've also done a lot of work in conservation finance. So it was those two things plus Wardy's background that enabled the Regen Farmers Mutual kind of idea to germinate. So I might pass across to Wardy.
Yeah, thanks, Rohan. I'm Andrew Ward, but everyone, even my mum calls me Wardy. So yeah, please call me Wardy. I guess I've got since '93, my old man went over to Alan Savory and studied under him and brought back holistic management to Australia. So by default, I've sort of been in regenerative agriculture since 1993 now. And yeah, as Rohan mentions, shared love of giving stakeholders an actual stake. And so the opportunity to work with farmers and catalyse Regen Farmers Mutual is a bit of a dream come true for me. Like, it's bang on. So yeah, anyway, pass it over to you, Rohan, to start our press.
Is that okay, Amy? Should we just launch in, or is there anything else?
I think so. I think we should go for it. Yeah, definitely. I've got somebody in the background. I'll try and help them jump in. But if you'd like to start, Rohan and Wardy, that would be great.
Okay. Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to share screen, everyone, and send you into the ether. All righty. So we're going to go through today, if this works. Wasn't even slide one. So this first, we're going to break this presentation into two parts. So the first part's really me talking about really high level environmental markets. So to give you a sense of what's happening in environmental markets. The next webinar will take a deeper dive into what that might mean, practically speaking, at a farmer level in relation to particular markets. And then Wardy's going to talk to some specific opportunities within markets. So that is kind of taking a step further, I suppose, into it. And then how you can possibly get involved, what's the departure point for getting involved in the Regen Farmers Mutual. So let's kick off with what's going on with these environmental markets, and where did the Regen Farmers Mutual come from, and how does it fit? And long story short, as we're all kind of only too well aware now, that there's a green transition happening across markets globally, and that farmers are part of that. But carbon markets are growing, starting from a low base. They've been around for the last 20 years, but they're starting from a low base. Last year there was, the total market size was 226 million. And the forecast from someone like the Climate Market Institute is suggesting that the carbon market will grow to 10 to 24 billion by 2030. Not only is the carbon market, anticipating growth, whether those numbers are right or not, there's large growth kind of in the pipeline. The other thing is that markets are growing and diversifying, so that there's also other markets emerging, so that biodiversity, we're all aware that we're in kind of an extinction crisis in some ways, but like the biodiversity is at a real risk, and that we need to look at land management practices to protect our biodiversity. And in addition to that, there's other types of environment markets that are kind of emerging that reflect whole of farm kind of activities. So how do we compensate farmers for doing good on their farm in total? So which includes animal welfare or water use and what have you. And so environmental markets are expected to grow very quickly, and it's going to be strong growth. But most farmers are basically too small to access them. They're not, the way markets are kind of constituted is it's difficult. They're complex. There's transaction costs are very high, and so that's the catalyst for the Regen Farmers Mutual. In terms of the markets, what we're seeing is that the price of carbon, I mean, this is on the map on the right here, we can see the price of carbon in Europe and how it's performed over the last kind of 8 or 9 years. And what's been happening is that governments are requiring that we price in these negative externalities, those impacts of fossil fuels that burning fossil fuel has on our environment. And by doing that, and the way we're doing that is through the carbon price. And so what they're doing in Europe is they're requiring carbon emitters to go and offset their carbon. So it's a different market in Australia, but in Europe it's a compliance market. And this changing in price, you can see that like they've gradually brought in more and more legislation across time to require emitters to do more and more, and that's driving demand in Europe and driving higher carbon prices. It's also driving higher energy prices, as we're seeing globally at the moment as well. In Australia, we're seeing a similar but slightly delayed response. And it's important to note Australia doesn't have a compliance market. It doesn't have a carbon price per se. It doesn't have this kind of requirement on emitters necessarily to, unless you're very large, to buy carbon credits. The way we've kind of approached carbon is through having the Commonwealth government be a buyer through the Emission Reductions Fund. And so what that has meant is that every, typically 2 auctions a year, the government steps into the market and says, oh, we'll buy carbon from the market. And so it's been very much a government-driven market, but corporates and institutions are stepping into the edges, as we're about to see. And so this is what's kind of catalyzing the recent rise in prices. As I say, the government has very much dominated these carbon markets, these environmental markets, which have been really around government carbon to date, but also biodiversity. So in terms of carbon, Commonwealth government bought 96% of ACCUs, the Australian carbon certificate unit. Sort of always get that back to front. The government bought 96% of that last year, and so the Commonwealth government is the biggest buyer of carbon in the country. So it effectively sets the marginal price, or has been setting the marginal price, and you can see that on the right, and you can just see the emergence of other buyers. And so the green voluntary cancellations, that represents the voluntary buyers in the market. They're buying ACCUs, these Australian government certified carbon credits. And on the voluntary market, that's what we're seeing globally, is the emergence of, particularly out of Europe and the west coast of America, the emergence of very large corporate demand this year, basically. And it's being driven by this, the net zero 2030 signatory, people, corporates signing up to that and recognizing they need to actually start acting upon it in their reporting. So the way the carbon market works in Australia from a voluntary perspective is that corporates, it's very much more price sensitive. It's price driven. It's again reflecting the fact that government's the biggest buyer, and to the extent that corporates have been buying, they've been doing on a voluntary basis. And so what that means is they have tended to buy a tiny little bit of Australian carbon credits and mix it with much cheaper carbon credits from offshore. So these, solar project credits can be bought for $1, $2, or $3 a tonne US out of India, whereas our carbon credits, as we just saw, anywhere from, they were $15 a tonne Australian dollars, but now they're stepping up to 30. And you can see that price differential means that because buying carbon credits just comes straight off the bottom line out of the profits of the corporates, they want to minimise the cost, and the way they're doing that is by buying the cheapest and then mixing it with the local carbon credits to create a narrative. So they say, in this example on the right, this was protecting koalas, which they had as bigger prominence on the page as this solar project. In fact, the solar project made up 95% of the total carbon being bought. And you can see this in the dynamics. So on the right-hand side here this is the total value of carbon traded in financial year 2021. And you can see that ERF deliveries, so that's the Emissions Reduction Fund, purchasing 188 million. So that's by far and away the largest buyer in the market. So that's the government. And down here on the left, you can see this voluntary demand, and you can see that the voluntary demand was might have been it's in terms of carbon credits was only 900,000 versus 8 million carbon units. So they're equivalent units. So they bought a lot less carbon through the voluntary market via ACCUs, but you can see that the price differential has been coming through there. So the ACCUs cost a lot more. And so what this means is that Australia's market reflects the kind of the dynamics of the government being the major purchaser. There's a saying that in the markets that supply always configures itself to meet demand, and in our market, the government is the major buyer. And what this means is that to the extent that voluntary markets are coming in, they're coming in around the government, and this market structure is the ACCUs are, from their perspective, expensive, and so this structure kind of inhibits growth of the market and leads to very high transaction costs, because a government dominated market is encouraging brokers, middlemen, to step into the void to enable these transactions to occur. And what the market really needs is standardization and competition to develop and to grow, basically, as we'll see. So in terms of growing, the government, on the government side of things, the markets are moving beyond simply carbon as well. So we're starting to recognise the need to, for example, look to biodiversity. And you're seeing this in the biodiversity stewardship program that was recently undertaken by the Commonwealth Government in pilot form, and they've now got that enhanced vegetation, remnant vegetation pilot that's going through. But similarly, in Queensland, you have the Land Restoration Fund, which has this concept of providing in effect, top-up funding or for carbon credits that offer more than simply carbon. So that looks to compensate farmers for biodiversity or for cultural benefits in the form of Indigenous credits. And similarly, these other programs that have either been announced in WA or are in development in Victoria and in New South Wales are similarly looking to be carbon plus type programs. So we know that Bushbank is a program that's been announced in Victoria, which is looking to compensate farmers in that region for biodiversity in addition to carbon. And the point we want to make is the government's good at handing money out, but they're not necessarily good at catalysing markets. They're still captured in this, captive to this process of, if they're the only buyer, the market will kind of configure itself to meet their demand, and the chances are that middlemen will kind of continue to dominate. So but the catalysts for change are there, in the sense of we're part of the Marketplace for Nature, which is a project that involves the ILSC, the 10 Desert Projects, Pollination Group, Nature Conservancy. And what that group has been looking at is how to expand markets beyond carbon and also beyond government. And so what we've been looking at there is how the markets globally are emerging and what can be done locally. And some key themes that have emerged there is that corporates are looking for carbon plus co-benefits as well. So they're looking for stories to go with the carbon, because they want to be able to describe to their consumers how they're benefiting the environment, basically. And similarly, the other kind of major theme that's been coming through is that corporates in particular, but also governments, are looking for greater transparency and standardisation to reduce transaction costs and therefore increase the kind of efficiencies of this market. So the Marketplace for Nature and the Carbon Farming Foundation, now WA, are kind of initiatives reflecting the need for change in the market. And so the need for change in the market, where Regen Farmers Mutual sits, is, as I said before, the current market has become broker dominated, in the sense that they're the middlemen that have enabled buyers of carbon to access markets, and whether it's government or voluntary markets. But what these brokers tend to do, that they're incentivized to maximize their margins, even if they operate within a non-profit. So, and I can say this because I used to be a broker. The way you maximize your margin as a broker is by promoting opacity. You fight against standardization. What you want to do is create a product, your product, to be slightly different from everyone else's. That's why you can't quite, your customers can't quite work out what your pricing is. And so typically these brokers can charge anywhere from, well, it's 30, 50, even up to 80% of the revenue being generated from a carbon transaction. And so the market as it currently stands is not conducive to promoting standardization. It's not conducive to promoting small farmers participating, and it's certainly not conducive to driving towards efficiency and transparency. And so what, in response to this, about halfway through last year, we started a process whereby we, under the cooperative farming program, we were funded to run a series of workshops where we explored the opportunities for farmers to come together to create a farmer-owned broker, to effectively disintermediate the current broker market and to capture more of the value. And so we ran through 3 series of workshops. The first one looking at the actual business, the problem and whether there was a solution and what that solution might look like. And that was, and out of that, there was a group of farmers who went through and looked at specifically the principles, what things would need to be agreed between them to enable this prospective mutual to actually deliver value to them. So out of that, we're able to identify the principles that farmers need to agree between themselves in order to create a mutual effectively. And the third one, we looked at how to scale a mutual. So out of this process came the idea that the steering committee would be formed and that we'd go ahead and kind of start the mutual. And that, and as of 1st of July, we did. And so this is the Regen Farmers Mutual. And so at its core, the Regen Farmers Mutual enables groups of farmers in local regions to come together to leverage its infrastructure to enable them to do transactions to deliver landscape scale impacts. So it enables a farmer in a region to enter into a carbon transaction or a biodiversity transaction where they get to keep ideally 80% of the value of that transaction, and 10% of that revenue then goes to the local farmer group who provides on-ground support with respect to those transactions, whether that's in the form of education or with respect to the data collection and management process on the ground. And then 10% of the revenue goes to cover the costs of operating the mutual. And so in this way, the mutual, by creating a farmer-owned broker, we can actually enable farmers to create more, in a sense, market power to deliver more value to them and to deliver better outcomes for the environment. And that's basically it. So I might hand across to Wardy at this point in time.
Thank you, Rohan. G'day, everybody. I'm going to be talking about how we take that backgrounding on how the markets are functioning, how the price has arrived at the price that it has, and tie that back to land management and what you're doing on the ground. So, Rohan, if you could skip to the next. Regenerative Farmers Mutual needs a definition of a regenerative farmer. Otherwise, who's the mutual for? So our definition is that you're making an economic and an environmental or ecological profit. We all know how to measure an economic profit. Accountants and accounting standards. And ecological profits are just as straightforward and common sense in that you're dealing with, reduced bare ground or increased ground cover, increased soil carbon or reduced soil carbon, increased biodiversity or reduced biodiversity. And it's very hard to call an economic profit and an ecological loss regenerative, because we know that if you mine away your ecological capital, eventually you create a desert or a collapsed society. And so you can't continue to be a miner and call yourself a regenerative agriculture person. So the Regen Farmers Mutual rather, is for people making an economic and an ecological profit. So what we're going to look at is how to sort of understand your options on your farm, how to make a plan towards those options, and then how to make money out of that. So the next step, please, Rohan, or next slide. I want to talk about what you can do on your own. And you can be like Atlas Shrugged or Hercules. You can lift the world, but actually saving the world is a team sport. So, if we're going to address biodiversity loss or avoid an extinction event through biodiversity loss or mitigate the worst effects of climate change, you can't do that on your own. It's a team sport. But what you can do on your own farm is access, green finance to build assets. So potentially you've got a dam and you can enhance that asset by taking a loan that's backed against the biodiversity that you plant around that dam. And not only does that planted biodiversity provide like habitat for animals, it provides you water for drought resilience and stock, but it also has like mental health benefits. Now that's an example of what you can do on your farm using environmental markets. In fact, Commonwealth Bank now has environmental linked loans to enable you to do that, exactly that sort of thing. Next slide, please, Rohan. Now, we got into the idea of Protected Habitat Farmers Mutual, which became Regen Farmers Mutual because of the story of Claire Cannon. So Claire worked as actually a person with Earthwatch in her early 20s in her university days, and took her environmentalism with her as she began to run the family farm with her husband and raise children and grow animals. But she recognised there was an opportunity when at Holbrook they had a highway extension, they needed some biodiversity offsets for grey box woodland, and she had some of that on her property. She understood that a covenant had a management agreement and that she'd still be able to graze that boxland area seasonally to prevent fires and to do so in accordance with ecology. But it wasn't the best part of their land. So she wasn't actually losing a heck of a lot of productivity under a conservation agreement. What she did get was a bunch of scientists that enabled her to do a carbon project. And as a result of that, she generated north of $250,000 worth of revenue from the carbon. But importantly, she now had this carbon story and she had the protection of habitat story. And both of those fed into brand. So she got her beef into the Cape Grim supply chain, which is a restaurant supply chain, and she got a premium from there, and her wool into the QZ supply chain, which meant she got a premium from there. So she was doing good ecologically and she was doing good economically. And so she was our first regenerative farmer. Let's go through a few more case studies. Thanks, Rohan. I want to talk to you about standing carbon because this is probably the most simple carbon deal a farmer can enter into, and it's the most often entered into apart from avoided emissions. So under the standing carbon scenario, the government has already a database called the Full Cam database, and you can map the boundary of your property and interrogate that Full Cam database to tell you what the government thinks it will pay you or knows it will pay you according to a formula based on you getting trees to a 2 metre height with a 20% canopy. So your job as a farmer, in order to access standing carbon, is buy the trees, plant the trees, get them to 2 years old with 2 metre height and a 20% canopy. And then by prescription, you'll be paid for the carbon that you've sequestered. Rohan, the next, great. So the prescription says that if you were looking at the map before and you planted your trees in a blue area, that middle column that says 22 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare, or that red colour in the same column, $271 or 271 tonnes of carbon equivalent per hectare. Rohan, if you could go back up to that previous slide. If you're building, as the farmers in Loddon Plains are, these standing carbon opportunities on their farm, one of the opportunities is to build where there's green and yellow and less where there's blue, because the difference between planting in a blue and planting in a red is about 10 times the amount of payment that you could get. We also want coordination, not just on the farm, but across farms. So in Loddon Plains, where we were looking, there's 2 populations of warblers in different trees, and they can't get to one another to make baby warblers in spring. But if the farmers plant their corridors in such a way that it's continuous habitat, more baby warblers. Fantastic. Next one, please, Rohan. Now, the other one that you probably have heard of is soil carbon. Now, all ERF projects and most carbon projects require a change in management practice in order for it to be called additional carbon that's been sequestered, as opposed to the carbon you would have sequestered if you just kept your farm practices the way they were. So the most common change is to go from set stocking to time-controlled grazing. Typically, that means going from fewer big paddocks with wire fences to lots of smaller paddocks separated by electric fences. You'll, next page, please, Rohan. With soil carbon, we've already seen that the voluntary market is particularly interested in this. So Wilmot and Cavan stations in New South Wales were able to sell, about 7 tonnes of carbon per hectare equivalent to Microsoft via Regen Network, and Microsoft paid them for sequestering carbon that they'd measured had built up in their soil as a result of their time-controlled grazing. I really applaud the work of Impact Ag and this, Wilmot station for blazing this path, but also applaud Microsoft, because what they recognised was 2 years ago, nobody was signed up to a carbon 2030 neutral pledge. Now there's over, I think it's 2,800 corporates have now signed up to a 2030 carbon pledge. What Microsoft did was explore and open source basically all their learnings about doing a voluntary carbon market transaction, so that other corporates could more easily understand what were the considerations of price and terms and discovery that Microsoft went through. And they can borrow some of those learnings and build on those learnings. Next slide, please, Rohan. There's also this idea of carbon plus stuff. So the ERF and the government created process is really thorough. As you would imagine, when you've had a policy and you've got scientists and they've created methods and they've regulated the heck out of them, and if you follow the bouncing ball, you'll be awarded with ACCUs, which you can sell to the government and you can get a price for. It's a very controlled, systemized regime. It's very well trusted internationally because of that hierarchy and regulation. But that enables us to attach things to the carbon, like biodiversity or cultural or social or other environmental benefits to the carbon, so that buyers can buy carbon that they're familiar with through the ACCU system, plus additional biodiversity. So next one, please, Rohan. We're looking at, with Amy and Jackie helping with Mick Taylor at Landcare Farming, and Adrian Ward, no relation, but bloody good bloke being a Wardy, from Accounting for Nature. we're looking at working with all of those people to help them define the biodiversity that's been increased in the Food and Agribusiness Network and sell that through the LRF, which accepts the ACU process, and then not just sell the carbon, but also sell the increased biodiversity as measured by an econt. Now, when this happens, this will be the first time biodiversity by accounting for nature has been, paid for through the LRF and the FAN network, but it's not the first time it's been valued. What's really fascinating is Adrian Ward mentioned to us that the price for biodiversity attached to each tonne of carbon or each ACU of carbon has gone from $3 to $30 in the last 12 months. The interest in carbon is good and the interest in biodiversity is equally as exciting. Next one, please, Rohan. So in summary, what the Regen Farmers Mutual does is we help those farmers understand and engage with the mutual, with a local group, within the context of their farm and their NRM plan, to come up with things that they can do on their farm, but also within a farm group to achieve landscape scale impact, and then be able to take to market their carbon or their biodiversity or their conservation assets on their property and maximize the value of those when selling them, and making sure that, that they're consistent with the NRM plan, that, they're leveraged and reducing the costs of the transaction wherever possible. Now, we understand that environmental markets are different to food and fibre markets. When you produce a tonne of wheat, you sell a tonne of wheat, you get paid for a tonne of wheat. When you sell carbon, it's 25 years of 1-year renewals based on the carbon that you said being in your soil or in your trees, or the environmental assets that you've had actually being measurably still there and improving. And if that's the case, you get paid annually based on performance. Next one, please, Rohan. And I wanted to talk more about landscape scale stuff because it's really interesting. When you go to an existing traditional broker, they're going to be interested in what you can do on your farm. They've already got an idea of how they're going to monetize you. So they're looking for simplicity in the transaction and maximizing their profits. One of the things that we're doing is looking for maximizing the value to farmers. So an example of that might be in for example, the eastern escarpment of Australia, where we've got this catchment area along the Great Dividing Range, where if rain is falling and there's more soil carbon, actually you'll absorb a lot more of that water and you'll hold on to it because of the soil carbon. And if you move out of that catchment into the valley, you'll have found that over time that riparian zone along the river has been cleared. And if you actually replant that using biodiversity offsets, as a farmer, you can get your saplings for free and you can get paid for the soil carbon for free. But coordinating what's happening in the catchment and in the riparian zone, those farmers can actually reduce the impacts of flooding. And that's something that the RTA, or the Transport for New South Wales, is really interested in, because they pay for repairs of roads. And, what's that? A pinch of prevention is worth an ounce of cure. They'd rather pay farmers to prevent flooding than to have to fix roads that are needing repair because of flooding. And so we've got the opportunity to help farmers individually sell their carbon or their biodiversity or their conservation value, but to also package up the combination of their efforts and sell them into additional markets, which unlocks additional value, which ends up in our members or the farmers' pocket. Next slide, please, Rohan. So if you're a farmer, you're probably wondering, well, how do you actually understand what's on my farm? How do I get started in terms of these environmental markets? And the answer is you need an environmental farm assessment. The environmental farm assessment collects your data, builds what we call a digital twin of your farm, a matched digital equivalent of your real world asset. And that digital twin can be interpreted by regulated and voluntary carbon markets, regulated and voluntary biodiversity markets, and the conservation markets. And as a farmer, you can get a full view of what your opportunities are based on your particular farm. Next one, please, Rohan. Clearly, once you've got that digital twin, options exist for you to understand what would happen under different climate or agronomy scenarios, and to model that, and to actually work out what your best gross margin would be, not just taking into account food and fibre markets, but also taking into account environmental markets. We know that we're going to require, for anybody who's selling carbon or biodiversity, to have a digital twin so that we can match what the buyers are paying for in their stewardship agreement with the annual measurements that the farmer is doing that assure the buyer that the thing that they're paying for is there. And once you've done those smart agreements for green or environmental markets, you also start to understand the greenness of that farm with respect to the food and fibre that it's producing. So farmers, whether they're selling direct to consumer or into supply chains and terminal markets, can now start to show people what the provenance of that food and fibre is. And that might help them retain access to markets, like if you're talking about beef producers going to Europe, or it might enable them to get a premium in markets like what we saw Claire got by getting her beef into the Cape Grim supply chain. Next one, please, Rohan. So if you're interested in taking the first step, head on to that website. It'll probably be dropped into our conversation link. I know I've talked for a long time. I'm going to shut up and answer any questions. And if you'd like to come off video while you're asking questions, that might be more conversational and interesting for everybody.
Does anybody have any questions they'd like to throw at Andrew and Rohan?
I thought of some, but oh no, I thought of some.
Scott,
Andrew,
on you, I'm sure you must have a question.
I'm Scott Clarke. I will, Andrew. Earlier I mentioned, what would the situation be for a farmer who has properties across different districts throughout Australia?
Yeah, I mean, every context, every farm is different. So each farm would need an environmental farm assessment of its own. Not just, you know, if they're within a state, maybe they're within the same regulatory regime. But from what you described to me earlier, Jackie, somebody that you know has got property in Queensland and New South Wales, even then, the environmental markets for biodiversity and conservation can be quite markedly different.
I ask a
Hi
question?
guys. Oh, now we all are.
Go for it, Jill.
I wasn't sure if there's a thing here where I'm meant to raise my hand, but anyway, I was just with the environmental farm assessment and the production of the digital twin. What's the process for that? Is it something that a farmer does on their own, or is there assistance and support provided to actually produce that end product?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. There's sort of three elements that come together to make it. So you get a questionnaire which farmers can complete 99% of it at their own leisure online. Then there is some mapping stuff. So using your boundary to investigate like zones, soil, vegetation and production zones being really important, and identifying sampling sites to get an idea of each of those zones. Now, once you've got your map and your sampling sites, there's an in-field collection of that data as well. So we use Accounting for Nature's Tier 3 method for vegetation and for soils, along with some water use efficiency metrics. We bring all of that data together into a data pool and a map, and that essentially is the first cut of your digital twin. And it becomes a digital twin when you actually keep that data flowing. So it's an accurate ongoing representation of the farm.
Okay, so you would have be able to have that loaded onto your computer and make changes as you go.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Nicole.
Hi guys, and apologies for the late entry. Zoom was not my friend today, and the video is not my friend either, apparently. Thanks for the session, guys. It's incredibly informative. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on the farm group and collaboration, and I guess the process of bringing that all together?
Yeah, so on the ground, transactions tend to be supported by advisors, whether they're agronomy or ecology, they're experts in the field. Now, often you might belong to FAN, or you might belong to a land care group or a group of practice or an industry group. And recognizing that, which came out of the feedback and co-design with our farmers, and recognizing that a mutual needs to be shared infrastructure, but it's impossible for it to employ enough people cost effectively around Australia to get scale. What we're doing is acknowledging farmers need 80% of the benefit themselves to see that, value proposition work for them. But the farm group also that supports the individual farmers and helps coordinate the individual transactions to achieve landscape scale impact. It's got essentially a revenue stream as a portion of the farmer's revenue stream for supporting the coming together, the marketing, and the ongoing compliance for all of the farmers in that area or in that group of practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it certainly does. And is the farmers that belong to that group able to kind of suggest initiatives or activities that as a collective they need to undertake to improve their practices?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole nature of each group is peer-to-peer. It's not our group, as in Regen Farmers Mutual tells you, you have to do this in your group. It's your group. So locally, that group can be as hands-on, hands-off, supportive, competitive, as the culture and context of that group dictate.
It's interesting that the opportunities in a region will clearly differ by the landscape in that area, and so we're looking to, for example, the NRM regional plans to try and get a sense of what the strategic priorities are in any particular region. And it's one of those kind of conversations that we're discovering that these NRM regional plans have been driven by government departments, and someone from the government department kind of puts this great document together and then goes on a shelf, and we're going, and no one ever looks at it again. Is the way it's been described to us. But we've said, well, because we've gone, can we actually get access to those plans to understand what the strategic priorities are in a particular region? Is it biodiversity? Is it water? In a particular region? Is it the flood mitigation that Waddy was talking about? And if we can understand what those are, then it can help inform how the opportunities for groups of farmers to come together. So it could be that that idea that Waddy was talking about, the biodiversity corridor, where those with respect to those birds in that particular region, that's part of the regional plan for that region. It's identified as being an opportunity.
Jackie, you've got your hand up. Do you have a question?
It's actually me. You put it up for me. Let me ask a question. Does the size of the property matter when you put together these plans? So each farmer, like obviously I'm close to the city too, so my land holding isn't going to be as great as somebody in the Mary Valley, for example. So is the size of the property relevant?
No, not actually too relevant, other than your ability to justify it as a farmer. The other thing is you don't have to necessarily be a food and fibre producer. It's more important that you're an active land manager. So if you've got a lifestyle block that's not producing food and fibre, but has a riparian zone, and you're willing to plant that out using biodiversity offsets and manage it appropriately, you can also join Regen Farmers Mutual. Now, the smaller farmers are typically out in like a ERF, which is the big stuff. You can't do a project under 40 hectares. And so very often smaller farmers are just cut out by that. Where we work at the Mutual, every farmer who enters into a stewardship agreement does so with the Regen Farmers Mutual Nature Fund. And then we aggregate the assets of all of those that are described by the stewardship agreement of all of those farmers. And then we can sell a big tranche of carbon for a price that that small producer otherwise couldn't get. And then that's how we help very small farmers get into a market that otherwise they would be precluded from. Ultimately, though, if you're so small that your financial payment for whatever you're going to do is, it'll be what's the word? Relative. You're not going to make millions of dollars off small hectares. You need bigger hectares to make bigger money.
In saying that, I understand that, but would obviously being closer to the city, the sensitivity to, like I think Rohan just mentioned that before, is that being closer to the city, the sensitivity of the land and the impact of humans is obviously higher. So that was sort of a question I had. Plans, the development plans, is that at our cost? So we go and get a plan with, who is it, Accounting for Nature, and then we can develop our, because obviously I have some ideas on what I want to do here prior to joining this meeting. If these things you discuss at that point, and then they come for review in the Regen Farmers Mutual.
Yeah, so typically you'll do your, get your environmental farm assessment, understand the opportunities across the different markets, and whether that's on your own or with your group or with advisors like agronomists and ecologists, you've got to come up with something that works for your context. But you don't have to do that on your own, like go out into the wilderness for 40 days, come back and tell us your plan. Like, we can work with you to fashion one that works, or you can work with your team group of advisors to get to there. But ultimately, you'll be joining a stewardship agreement between yourself as a member of the Mutual and the Nature Fund. And that stewardship agreement's going to want to understand what are the actions you're taking and how you're measuring that, and how does that lead to the objective the buyer has and the outcome that you've described for the land. And if those things remain consistent in your land plan and move you forward, you'll continue to be paid, or you'll need monitoring and management to continue to be paid. But yeah, your farm plan is bespoke. It's your farm plan. You're signing up to what you think you can do. And based on that, we'll remarket your environmental assets and environmental good. And when we remarket that, 80 cents in the dollar comes to your hip pocket, 10 cents in the dollar comes to the group that you're part of, and 10 cents in the dollar stays for the technology and marketing costs of the transaction.
But who does all the work? You've got a lot of things to do on farm. You've got a lot of marketing and promotion to do. There's so much stuff to get done. We pay carbon aggregators 25%, so you're only talking a 5% difference. I'm just wondering who does all this work in the middle, whether it's members of the mutual that are supposed to do all the work, which should more than make up the 5%.
Yeah, I mean, members of the mutual, depends, Tim. So it depends on the nature of the work. You can't, for example, baseline yourself. You're going to need to get third parties to baseline yourself if you're doing a carbon project. So that work still needs to be paid for. But the mutual has the, not right now, but has the desire to be able to front end the costs for our members to get their measurement done and pick up the cost recovery as the member enters into a financial transaction. But right now, as we sit here today, we don't have the funds to front load many farmers into their first transaction. The other thing is 25% is really good value. If you've got a carbon aggregator offering for you to keep 75 cents in the dollar.
That's climate friendly, lady. That's for everyone.
Yeah, right. That is interesting. I hadn't heard that because my understanding of their model wasn't that. So anyway, yeah.
I think it would, even marketing the idea, like if you came to me and said, I need 50 places, they've got to be in these regions because I want to do a koala advocate or I've got to do a bird advocate or whatever, I could probably find them. But I think that's like maybe pushing from the market, going backwards rather than going to farmers and going, oh, what have you got? You know, I think that might even work because I'm doing this LRF stuff at the moment, doing, you know, consulting work for all those. There's just so many farmers around who've got no idea what they've got sitting there. So if you worked it the other way and said, okay, and, you know, in such and such an area, I think we've got a Great Barrier Reef benefit or the roads project benefit or whatever you're talking about before, and just do it the opposite way around. Go and target people based on what assets you think they've probably got from the maps.
That is how every broker works, and that's at our disposal to work that way. I guess the difference is between us and other brokers is we'll also proactively go and look for markets that don't exist. So go to Transport for New South Wales around flood mitigation. So yes, you're right. We can easily interrogate the full CAM database and go, well, this is precisely where we need to be planting trees for maximum return. But actually what we want and what separates us from a traditional broker that can do that is to actually come from the ground up rather than from the market back. But in practice, every broker in market at the moment knows what their demand is, knows what will be paid, and all they're doing is going to farmers and saying, can you supply to meet this market?
So the way the way that a typical broker will find the buyer first, and the buyer will say, I want X. So they're working for the buyer, right? And so they're working for the buyer and they're trying to find sellers to actually meet that buyer's demand. That's the mechanics. Whereas one of the advantages the mutual has is that apart from that full CAM for standing carbon, the data with respect to, for example, biodiversity is and remnant veg is, depending on where you are in the country, sketchy to good. It's not high quality. It's like, so as opposed to the standing carbon where the government's mapped the countryside and said, right, on that particular bit, come a hell or high water, we're happy to pay $700 a tonne. Whereas for these other markets, there's a, if you looked at the enhanced veg kind of process, the data's not the same. So one of the advantages of the mutual is through that environmental or farm assessment, we're enabling farmers to collect their data, but do it in such a way that they're not sharing it with third parties. And that data is high, it's credible, and it's also high quality visibility about what's on that particular piece of land. So in talking to both DOR, you know, and National Landcare Network and NRM Regions Australia, they're starting to see that, oh my God, this is a way we can get access to. We'll have to incentivise farmers to share that data, and we haven't kind of got to the bottom of what that actually means. But this data, if it's collected on farm by farmers and controlled by farmers, is actually high quality data with respect to the opportunities on that farm over and beyond standing carbon. So it's actually coming at it from a different perspective. So when you talk about you know, climate friendly, it's got a you know, koalas or what have you, they've either got a corporate buyer, or if they're coming with a government buyer and they're being driven by anything other than standing carbon, their access to quality data requires farmers actually providing that anyway. So we think that's an opportunity for the mutual to help farmers to collect their data in such a way that they actually control the way that it's shared, if at all.
That was an example. I don't know if they've got to deal with koalas, but that's an example. And I mean, we don't know what's here. Half the place you go to, because when we all got our assessments done last year, this bloody found some tooth frog or something, and no one knew they had a tooth frog on their place. So there's a lot of stuff around that. It needs people on the ground actually doing the work, and I don't think that's being catered for in this model at all.
In this model? So
well, in your 20% that you're taking, no one's on the ground doing the work. That's what I can't see in the whole how it all works. You need to have people on the ground doing the work to find all these things out.
That's what the 10% is. Sorry, Tim, I'll be specific. So the person in your local area that's coordinating your group, that's organising and onboarding all of the farmers, they might organise or do the environmental farm assessment or the baselining. And for that, they're getting 10 cents in the dollar off your environmental transaction and everybody else in that group who's doing an environmental transaction. So there's a commercial arrangement in there to put boots on the ground. Sorry, Tim, I misunderstood what you were talking about.
Yeah, that's what I was asking, yeah.
So that's what the 10 cents in the dollar for the farm group is for. Yeah. Any other questions? I'm aware we've kind of gone over time. So Amy, I'll hand back to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Andrew and Rohan. That was a very informative, as always, our first webinar, Understanding Environmental Markets. And in 2 weeks' time, I'm going to hand over to Jackie. She's going to talk to the next series of webinars. I think it's the 9th, but I'll hand over to you, Jackie, if you'd like to talk about that. But thanks again, Andrew and Rohan, and everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you, boys. That was great. And we'll see you again tonight. If anyone wants to go again, you can register for the 8 p.m. session tonight. After that, what you can do next is jump on the wait list. I think that, well, Bronwyn Neundorf, I'm not sure where your closest group is going to be, and same for Natalie and the other lady who is here, Jill.
Yeah.
Other than that, the rest of us are in the Mary Valley group, or Mary Burnett group. In 2 weeks, on the 9th of November, we will have the second webinar, which is the accessing the environmental markets. So Leah is going to send out the links to join that. Thanks, Leah. And that'll be just going deeper into the actual trading. So we will see you then.
Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Amy.
Leah?
Yeah, I've put some links into the chat, but we'll also follow up with an email. So we do have a social learning group. If anybody has any questions that weren't answered today, which you're welcome to join, you can ask us any questions that you want at any point in time. And also the wait list is there as well, which has got no obligation for you to join as well. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone.